Good morning and welcome to this presentation on the young care spectrum. My name's Ed James and I'm a researcher here in Cardiff University. I will introduce myself in more detail once we begin the presentation, but just to say that this is a re-recording of the presentation part of an ExChange seminar from a few weeks ago. The seminar itself was a half-day event that was run in person and included this presentation, but also discussion with the policy officers and practitioners who attended. It's being re-recorded because the audio and video quality was not great, but it also lets me include a couple of extra things. So first of all, I'll refer to some questions and include some questions that came up on the day. And also I'll give a little bit of a summary of the discussion that was had. So thank you for coming to this presentation on the young carer spectrum, investigating the larger population to better understand and support those with problematic caring roles. My name's Ed James and I'm a researcher here in Cardiff University. I recently finished my PhD study that was called Caring Lives and concerned the wider young carer spectrum and why the impacts of caring vary for individual children depending on their caring and family circumstances. The PhD was based in CASCADE, which is the Children's Social Care Team, and Decipher, which is the Public Health Team, and it was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. I should say as well, prior to that, I worked in children's rights and participation for about 12 years, with that including some work with young carers. And I'm now on a one-year fellowship to basically take the findings of the PhD forward, so to increase the impact, basically. That will include writing papers and conferences, but it also has a major focus on engaging with policy and practitioners, which is why this ExChange event was really useful opportunity. So just to briefly go through some aims for the session, I'll give a brief background of young carers research and consider what we know, but also who we know about, and therefore by extension, who we don't know about. I'll introduce Caring Lives and share some key findings that are of relevance to health, education, and social care practitioners, as well as to policymakers. And then on the day itself, we had a practitioner-led discussion on those key findings and what it could mean for practice, and also a discussion on the potential for an evidence base for practitioners of what works when supporting young carers. And I'll give a little bit of a summary of what came out of those discussions at the end. So thinking about the background, some background in terms of young carers research. First of all, what do we know? So we have young carer definitions. So definitions tend to vary quite a lot in research and policy, but most highlight 4 attributes, and then the specifics of those attributes maybe are quite different. So the first attribute is age. So young carers are under the age of 18. There was a few years ago some debate over extending that to the age of 25, but now most research recognizes them as a separate population of young adult carers, and that group has a different, because they're balancing their caring with a different set of other things in their lives, they often face a different set of challenges. The second is that young carers have some level of caring responsibilities. In the past, it's been a real focus on those with substantial roles, but there is an increasing focus on the wider population, which is maybe where my research interests mainly lie. The third attribute is the care receiver, and that they are normally a member of the family, of the young carer's family. It does vary a bit. Sometimes it's more limited to being those in the household, so those in the same home as the child. And sometimes it's slightly wider in terms of including potentially like family, friends, for example. And then the fourth is the reason for support. So this is the most complex of the four attributes. And initially it started out that the care receiver has an illness or disability. Quite quickly, there were debates over the inclusion of substance misuse and mental health issues. And they're now pretty much accepted into that definition, but there is still ongoing inclusion of other groups, such as parental absence, such as language brokering, where the child acts as a translator for family members. So just to kind of refer to a question that we had on the day and whether it matters if services are supporting young carers that maybe don't fit this definition, I would say it's more of an issue for research, because if we want to know that the research that we do as a research community all reflects the same population, we need to have a relatively standard definition. When we don't have a definition that's standard, it can mean that kind of innovative findings in a particular study, there's doubts over whether that reflects what most people would see as young carers, or whether it reflects the population that they studied being slightly different. In terms of services, in terms of policy, it's maybe less important. And we do know that policy, or countries around the world have policy that defines young carers slightly differently, and that services often are a bit more varied in terms of who is able to attend, for example, a young carer project. So on the day, we had a little bit of a discussion around impacts and benefits, impacts and benefits. But just to kind of pull some of this together and give a little bit of a summary. So researchers found maybe predominantly negative impacts, but also positives. And just to give a little bit of an idea of these. So initially, a lot of research focused on the common idea of life balance. So most children and young people, they have school and they have social lives, and that maybe makes up the main elements of their life. And it's about balancing those two areas. For young carers, we have this third area, the kind of care and responsibilities that they have. And we know that maintaining this life balance can be quite challenging. If caring has an effect on education, this can be in the form of reduced attendance or possibly more lateness. It can also affect homework. And then in the medium term, that can affect success in school. So kind of qualifications. And then moving forward, so long-term possible impacts on whether young carers go to university and on the jobs that they get. In terms of the personal and social side, if young carers are spending more time caring, they have less time to see friends, and then this can cause kind of loneliness and isolation. Over time, it's been expanded, so research has increasingly moved beyond this focus on life balance and looked at some of the individual impacts, most often around mental health. This includes anxiety, depression, worry about the care receiver, as well as about their kind of situation, and also things like anger, things like lack of sleep. At the same time, it's not all negative. There are also positives. This can include the satisfaction of helping a person that they are often, but not always, very close to. And that can give them a lot of kind of satisfaction and kind of well-being benefits. And then beyond that, we have psychosocial skills, also known maybe as life skills, things like friendliness, maturity, helpfulness, independence. And these are skills that enable people to have good relationships with others. And normally we'd expect children to develop these over time, so as they reach adulthood, but we know from research that they're developed earlier and often to a higher level for young carers. And then the last thing in terms of what we know, it's been long recognised that young carers are a diverse population. So Becker in 2007, who is the world leading researcher for young carers over the last 30 years, he argued that we differentiate between young carers in two ways. And I'm just going to turn on my pointer. So Becker differentiated between young carers in two ways. First of all, we have the amount of time they spend caring. And then we also have sometimes the regularity of care as well. It's the first, but then we also have the type of responsibilities. And this can vary from responsibilities that we'd see as being acceptable for a child to have, and those that we'd see as being inappropriate for a child to have, with this including things like personal care and medication, in particular, giving injections. So he differentiated between young carers in these two ways. In terms of what we, or who we know about and who we don't know about, we have this challenge of identification. So many young carers don't want to be identified by services. This can be because of a worry of kind of community stigma from the area where they live, and also intervention by services. And that intervention can range from low level all the way up to the child potentially being removed from the home. There's a lack of research on whether this is the case, but there's certainly the fear there, and that means that many can be reluctant to come forward. So this kind of has creates three main challenges, and these challenges vary for the different groups that are maybe involved in research or support. So first of all, how can practitioners support a group who often don't want to be found? We then have, how do we estimate their prevalence? So studies of prevalence for young carers have ranged significantly. In the early days, it was under 1%, but now when we have maybe more reliable methods of estimation, it's quite widely accepted that prevalence is between 4 and 8%, but there are studies as high as 12 and 17. So this is a challenge if we don't know prevalence, because that can affect funding, provision, essentially, for young carers. And then the third we have, which is maybe a problem more for researchers, how do we identify young carers from the wider population to be involved in research? The challenge of trying to find them, maybe in the general population, has resulted in a lot of research essentially working through young carer projects and recruiting those who are already accessing support. It's thought that those access support are likely to be those with more significant responsibilities, either because the family's reached crisis point to the extent that services have kind of noticed that there's something that's not quite right, or possibly because the family themselves have realized that support is needed and therefore that they come forward. But that creates this issue because it means that most of what we know about young carers in terms of the positive and negative impacts reflect the group on the right. So reflects those with more substantial responsibilities. On the flip side of this, the group on the left, those with lower responsibilities, we don't really know anywhere near so much about. We expect that the negatives will be less and the positives will be more because they have smaller roles, but we don't really know that if we don't test it. And then this creates a so what question, basically. So if children's social care and social care more generally is aimed at supporting and improving the lives of those most in need, if research is focusing on those who are likely most in need in terms of the young carer population, and policy and practice is then supporting those with the most problematic roles. Does it matter that we don't know about the wider population? For me, I think it raises key questions of whether we can understand the whole population when we only work with one part. And that's what kind of underpinned the study and what I'll kind of return to at the end. So just to introduce the Caring Lives project, Caring Lives is or was a mixed method study of the young carer spectrum. This session will mostly focus on the qualitative research that was done, but I might reference some of the quant at times. Because it's a study of the young carer spectrum, I used a broad definition. So this is basically the definition that I used, and it is modified from that was created by Becker to reflect the wider population. So children and young people under 18 who provide or intend to provide care, assistance, or support to another family member or members due to an illness or disability, mental health, or substance misuse issue. They assume a level of responsibility which may, depending on the support that is in place, both within and from outside the family, have an impact on their lives. And I'm not going to focus too much on the method that was used, but just to think about it in a little detail. So the study set out to confidentially recruit young carers in the school setting. Obviously, there were some quite big ethical challenges of this. So in particular, how to maintain the confidentiality of those that became involved, in particular, how to maintain the confidential status of those who did not want to be known by services. So obviously this went to Cardiff University SOCSI ethics group. And while they were keen on it, they also wanted more detail of how this would be managed. And that resulted in a 3-stage recruitment procedure. So first of all, schools were recruited, and each school that became involved, I worked with them to ensure that a process was developed that fitted their individual school procedure. So basically ensuring that confidentiality could be maintained in the individual setting. And that is both through the recruitment process and through the interview process. So I then engaged with pupils through assemblies. Sometimes these were delivered to the whole school. Sometimes they were delivered to each year group, or potentially sets of year groups separately. But the aim was to use a method that ensured the information reached all pupils. So basically it would enable, it would reach those who were accessing services, it would reach those who were unknown to services but knew they were young carers, and it would also reach those who had not realized, that they were young carers. And then the third, so seeking consent from participant families. And that was done through basically having a point of contact in the school, someone who often had a role that was confidential in nature. So, for example, a school counsellor, someone in the wellbeing team, people who basically were used to working with individual pupils on a confidential level, and they kind of supported the seeking of consent. I should say that recruitment process was expected to be challenging, and it did prove to be challenging. So without going into too much detail, having multiple stages of recruitment essentially led to a loss of participants over the different stages. So people that were interested at some level dropped out by the next level because it was too time consuming, or because it, for example, it went to families who then decided they didn't want to be involved. And after the best part of a school year of recruitment, I had recruited 5 people, and at that point it was expanded to include projects. So I should say as well that the initial plan for the study was to work with a small group, but to work with them over a period of time. So basically a small sample, but that would be followed over the course of a year, and 3 interviews. So what it is, it's a study of a small group, but in a lot of depth, basically. And just to think about the final sample, so 5 were recruited from projects. 4 of those were caring for parents and 1 for a brother. All responsibilities were substantial. All were known to mainstream services, by which I mean education, health, or social services, but none were accessing mainstream support. And then all of them were accessing a young carer project. So that sample is very much in line with what we see in past research in terms of the type of young carers that are involved. Then on the kind of opposite side of this, 5 were also recruited through schools. Again, 4 were caring for a parent and 1 for a sibling, this time a sister. Their responsibilities varied from minor to substantial. Most were known to mainstream services. Most were unknown to mainstream services, and none of them were accessing a young carer project. So you can see that that population is very different. And I should also say that the focus of the study, in following them 3 times over a year, was to develop an initial idea of their caring circumstances, of their family circumstances, and also their mental health, and then to look at how their health changed as their circumstances changed over time. To refer to a question again that someone asked on the day, they asked whether impact would likely to vary by age and also by ethnicity. So I should say that obviously the sample is small, but I would say that it does represent a wider range of young carers in past research. At the same time, this was with 13 to 17-year-olds, and it is likely that if the same research was done with under 12s, it would be different. And also, if the research was done with a broader range of ethnicity, it would also be different. So just to think about some of the key findings, and the first half of these will focus on caring responsibilities, and then the second will focus on the potential for support to kind of reduce the negative impacts and potentially increase the positive impacts. I should say that I'm going to include a number of quotes. I'm not going to talk through those quotes. I'll kind of talk around the edges. And also just to say that all of the names are pseudonyms. So a lot of the findings on caring responsibilities concerned whether young carers feel in control of their caring role. And first of all, so several participants had lower level and stable responsibilities, and they felt able to kind of control the classic balance in terms of caring, school, and social life that we see in young carers research. So Angela cared for her mother, who had multiple sclerosis, but at the same time, her mum was largely independent, and as a result, her responsibilities remained manageable and relatively low level. She felt able basically to manage those responsibilities alongside her homework, alongside going to school, and alongside social opportunities, with the exception maybe of just needing to plan things a bit more maybe than other children and young people. It was also possible for participants who had more substantial, but again, stable responsibilities to benefit. So Harry was a long-term carer for his brother, who had autism. He had been a carer since about the age of 5. And while his responsibilities had initially changed quite a lot, grown essentially over time, they had been stable for several years, and he'd largely become accustomed to the role that he had, the caring that he provided. So in terms of impact, he reported tiredness, but aside from that, quite a lot of kind of positive life skills, so confidence, independence, maturity, etc. So these kind of, the ability to manage responsibilities was not the same for the whole group. So instability in the care receiver's condition was one of several threats to this control that I've already mentioned, because it essentially caused fluctuation in the caring role of young carers. So and these fluctuations could be short-term or they could be long-term. So for Fia and Lyra, they were sisters and they cared for their mother who had bipolar disorder. And she had maybe fluctuations in days or weeks in terms of mood, but she also had 2 periods of being institutionalized. And each time she came out of hospital, her needs were significantly higher and then would decrease over time. So this would affect Fia's education. So there were periods, significant lengths of period that Fia spent outside of education completely. And then she would go back into school and attempt to kind of catch up, basically, especially in terms of her being at the point of doing GCSEs. Then for Lyra, some of the impacts were more in terms of kind of social. So when her mother was particularly unwell, she would be going out less. And then as a result, Lyra would be going out less. Whereas in contrast, when her mum was feeling better and more active, Lyra would also be more active. So we've got a couple more in terms of the caring responsibility side. So large amounts of caring place significant strain on young carers and their management of the role. So essentially, excessive care was another threat to the control that young carers had. Patrick cared for his sister, again, before and after school. And because of that, his social life was largely carried out in school time, and his homework was largely carried out in school time as well, all fitted around his caring. He also talked about staying up late at night, so effectively monitoring Charlie, who was his sister. She would go to bed at about 11 and he'd be up till 1 or 2 in the morning, kind of making sure everything was okay. Similar for Sophie, who we'll move on to in a minute. She cared for her mother, who had diabetes and also a hearing impairment, and this meant that she couldn't hear alarms at night, so a diabetes pump alarm basically at night. And again, Sophie would be up till 1 or 2 every morning, and if she was worried, so if she was worried about her mum's blood sugar levels, she'd be up till even later, so 3 or 4, and this resulted in both her but also her mother being tired. And then thinking a bit more about Sophie again, so medical responsibilities, including injections and rebalancing blood sugar levels, were particularly distressing when there was a problem. So her role, also her mother, had a particular element of her illness, maybe, that would cause her blood sugar levels to become unstable at night. So they could spike or they could fall quite drastically and at short notice. And this resulted in her having a real kind of monitoring role, but also often force feeding her mother at night and occasionally giving injections. And she kind of stressed the difference between her general caring responsibilities that she found quite easy to manage, and the distress that she felt when she was given medical care, and in particular where the medical care was not working. So effectively, basically not working to bring her blood sugars down. And I'll come back to Sophie later because she would actually go on to access significant health support that made a real difference to her life. So the second part of this is to think about the support side. So how support from services can act as a mediator. It will mostly concern services, but there is also a bit of an element of informal support that we're kind of think about first. So while most participants were very, very close to the person that they cared for, a problematic relationship could exacerbate already negative impacts. So this is returning to Patrick, who, as we talked about before, was providing care for his sister. And Patrick was one of two young people whose final interview happened during COVID. And maybe slightly surprisingly, he talked about how his responsibilities were largely the same. So he was at home more, his sister was at home more, but his parents were also at home more, and they were more involved in caring. And that kind of meant that Patrick's responsibilities stayed about the same as they were. What there was a problem with, however, is that their already difficult relationship deteriorated further. So his sister was increasingly isolated as she was shielding, and Patrick felt increasingly targeted and also became increasingly tolerant of her, basically. So the next one, so moving into formal service support. So participants reported different motivations for attending young carer projects, and different ways that they worked, but also a largely positive set of impacts. So I should say that in particular, one young person was particularly interested in accessing the kind of social side of support. His family were quite private, and he intentionally joined a community project that did not assess needs. This was quite different for the other four who joined projects where they had needs assessment when they joined. And that led to support and advice that linked to the caring that they did. So all five, whether all five reported benefits of the project, whether it was the social side or whether it was wider. And Harry, he focused on the positive recognition and the interest that he felt workers had in him, while Fia highlighted the kind of benefits to her confidence of being able to meet with other young carers and also being able to meet with practitioners and get support. Thinking about schools, so most project users were known to their schools, but none were accessing support. For some, it was their own choice. So they felt that they would seek support as and when needed. And for others, it was because of a lack of provision. And Fia in particular talked about the fact that her school had a young carers policy and a person who had specific responsibilities for supporting young carers, for meeting them on a timely basis, for basically like putting in place quite a good level of support. At the same time, she reported that effectively she hadn't had a meeting with this support worker for a couple of years, essentially, and that the support that was meant to be in place was basically missing. Thinking about health, many were supporting the family member to attend medical appointments. And with the exception of Sophie, that we'll move on to in a minute, a lot of them felt able to contribute, but were rarely being recognised or actively involved. So kind of the idea of invisibility and lack of recognition that we see in a lot of past research. So For Harry, he wanted to have access to information that could help improve his caring, and that wasn't given. And then for Patrick, he felt able to actually contribute at these medical appointments, and essentially wasn't being asked. And then thinking about returning to Sophie then. So Sophie was very much the odd one out. So she was recognized by a diabetic nurse, and this led to support training and new equipment that was basically really beneficial. So she had been recognized just before the first interview, and when we met for the first time, she talked about expecting a new pump that would be better suited to her mother and to the family. At the second interview, it had been installed, but there were a few kind of problems. And then at the third interview, it was making a real difference. So basically, the new pump, which her mum was connected to at night, improved her mother's quality of life significantly. So it improved her mother's sleep, basically. Meant she was being less disturbed during the night. And then this kind of had the indirect benefits of also benefiting Sophie. So she had less responsibilities, less inappropriate responsibilities in terms of medical care, and she was also having more sleep, and gave examples of going to bed early and sometimes being able to sleep through the whole night. Moving towards the end of the presentation, working with the larger young carer population enabled the development of a model of control. And I'm going to put it up in 3 different stages. And each of the stages have a different level of responsibilities, which you can see at the top, and also a different level of kind of support needs. So first of all, we have what is basically the middle, and maybe the group that is what we often see in past research in terms of those that access young carer projects. So this is a group that have substantial responsibilities that they struggle to balance. And that can be because they either spend a lot of time caring, it can be because they have tasks that are maybe inappropriate to their age. But in the case of my quant work, also found that duration of care is key. So there was quite a significant deterioration in mental health for long-term young carers, especially those with substantial roles, compared to short-term young carers. So then in terms of the support needs they have, these are also maybe needs that we quite often see in terms of past research. So the need to identify them, and in particular to identify them by mainstream services such as school, such as education, such as health, such as social services, and to give them an assessment, which they have the right to in law. I also found that looking at young carer projects, which are more likely to individualize support, that is something that could be carried into some of the mainstream services for those who have reduced control as a result of more substantial responsibilities. Thinking about a second group, and this is a group with higher level needs. So those who have particularly problematic roles, in particular medical responsibilities, if they have a problematic relationship with the person they care for. It could probably be argued that personal care could also be included, but that wasn't included in, so none of the sample that I worked with had any of those roles. So it's not possible to include without further work. And then thinking about the support that they need, basically there's a need to better support the care receiver, or so maybe traditionally we think about the need to train those young carers who have medical responsibilities, and there's a lot of concern over whether that training is taking place. I guess the alternative to that, which we saw in the case of Sophie, is that we better support the care receiver, and then that removes at least the inappropriate side of caring from those young carers' roles. And then the mediation is as a potential way to support those that have the kind of problematic relationship. And then moving on to the third part of this, which is the outer ring. So with the recruitment being through schools and leading to a wider sample in terms of the young carer spectrum, this enabled a study of the wider group, and we can contrast their experience of care, their impact, their support needs with the first two tiers. So this is a group where most of the young carers in it largely feel in control of their role as a result of them having a manageable role in terms of time, appropriate responsibilities as well. And in terms of the support needs, it's kind of about recognizing that if we see young carers as a much larger population, it's not about saying they all have high level support needs, certainly not if they're accessing support through family. But it does, however, suggest that they need to be on the radar, maybe, of schools. They need to be on the radar of doctors, partly for if the situation deteriorates over time. One thing that did come up, though, is that the need for all young carers to have the medical information they need to provide care. So effectively, that means you have a small group that need the training because they have really high level medical roles, and then a large group that just need information about the illness itself and how they can provide support. So just to pull some of this together then, so researchers traditionally viewed the social issues of young carers from the perspective of those with inappropriate and excessive roles. In terms of this study, research in the wider spectrum enables a bigger focus on the full breadth of experiences, the positive and negative impacts that can change over time, and therefore the varying needs that they have. So for me, this helps us understand why some young carers are able to manage their responsibilities while others have less control. And this is useful when considering why and how caring becomes problematic and how to provide support. I think as well, there's a couple of implications. So most of the support that is currently provided to young carers, especially in terms of young carer projects, but also in terms of mainstream, is generally aimed at the second tier of that three-tier model. And as I said before, it's not about saying that all young carers need a high level of support, but those in the first tier do need age-appropriate information on the illness that the person has and how to provide support. And then at the other end of this extreme, those in the highest level tier need more specialist support than is currently being offered, basically. And then to be slightly challenging, maybe, it also suggests a need to reconsider how we raise awareness of young carers. We know that young carers and families as well feel stigmatized and reluctant to come forward. And for me, there's a potential issue that we traditionally focus on raising awareness of the problematic side of young carers rather than the wider group. I'm really interested in developing further research that looks to raise awareness of the wider spectrum. So basically, going into schools, for example, highlighting that young carers are actually a large population, a diverse population, with positive impact as well as negative impact. And then that kind of larger message becomes the foundation to highlight those with more problematic responsibilities and the need to identify them. So in terms of the exchange day, at that point, we basically stopped for a break And we did some questions, and we also did some quite quick feedback that was used to inform the discussion that was held later. So essentially, practitioners and policymakers that attended were able to identify things, whether it was challenges, implications, opportunities, that they were particularly interested in discussing later in the day. And we split into two groups. And just to kind of give a very brief kind of summary of the kind of things that came up. So the first group looked at the challenge of identification, which obviously we know to be a really big long-term problem, and basically ideas on ways to try and resolve some of it. So obviously we looked at the focus being the role of healthcare and education, which is largely what we currently see in policy. But within the group, there were examples of sharing new and different approaches to identification. So in particular, we had people sharing examples of doing class level awareness raising, which they felt was more successful in terms of identification, and also using kind of new technologies as ways to identify. So for example, QR codes, which people scan, and they then are asked if they're a young carer or not, but they also have a second question that basically says, do you want to be, do you want your school to be notified, or do you want a young carers project to be notified? So basically giving them control over who they tell, and potentially the support that they are later able to access. And then we also just did a bit of thinking around the threshold of support. So based on the kind of the young carer model that I presented and the 3 tiers, what is the threshold for support? At what point are services needed? And then the second group looked at multi-agency working. I should say we did swap as well. So each group had a chance to look at each of the 2 topics. But the second topic was multi-agency working. Part of this discussion was around who needs to be involved. And there was a bit of the usual suspects in terms of education and health and social services. In addition to that, there was also third sector and youth services in Wales as well, both in terms of practice and research. There's been a real focus on pharmacists, so also they were named as a group that should be involved. And it was felt that in terms of what the multi-agency work should be doing, part of it is sharing good practice. So what works when identifying and supporting young carers, sharing of information, and having a central point of contact. So a person that is responsible for making sure that the different services get the information that they need about different young carers, which can better enable joint working. We did also talk a little bit about the challenges of GDPR when we want services to be sharing information. And this kind of led to a bit of a discussion over maybe how we can learn from other areas of children's social care who use multi-agency working already and have presumably overcome the issue of data protection and data sharing. And then the last thing that we did, so the last part of the morning was a discussion on the potential to develop basically an evidence base of research with young carers. And I kind of, again, gave a very quick introduction, a couple of slides, where I argued that most of the research into young carers is based on their experiences. And obviously, as someone who's involved in children's rights and participation, having the young carer at the centre of research is fantastic. But it does mean that most of what we know about young carers is about the caring that they do, the support that they do or don't receive, and maybe the support that they think they need. Of course, we don't really know if that support is successful until we go back to them. So at the minute, most research looks at what young carers think they need. That therefore means that there's a focus on the problem, and that because there's little research with practitioners, there's less of a focus on maybe what works. So we did think about some of the evaluations that have been done as well, in particular of young carer projects, which maybe look at whether they work, but maybe not why they work. And so that kind of led us to this discussion, because one of the things I'm interested in is developing funding bids for research with practitioners that could build this evidence base. So essentially things like practitioners' awareness of requirements, what works in different settings, and what are the barriers. So this led to a final couple of sets of discussion. First of all, we thought about what do new and existing practitioners need. And the first part of that was training. So right at the very top. So training on what young carers are, training on child protection and safeguarding, relationship skills that enable people to work with young carers. And that was very much whether that's something that they already have or whether that's something that they learn, again, through training potentially or through kind of experience. We thought a bit about awareness of policy and legislation and what practitioners are expected to do. That's something that maybe needs to be improved. They need time to figure out how to support young carers and to put that into action. They need stability, which both is of benefit, obviously, to the project in terms of offering a stable long-term provision, but also leading to like people that obviously do the job, also having long-term and stable stability. And then we also talked about support, particularly support from managers. And then last of all, we thought a bit more, this led to a discussion on ideas for possible practitioner research. And again, part of this was on like whether practitioners understand the young carer role. We thought about the potential to do evaluations of training, and this could be both in terms of the like how long training is, how many sessions people need of young carer training, how often we do refresher courses, whether the content in it is correct, but also the potential to do research into the quality. So to work with practitioners on what is good about training currently and what could be improved, basically. And then last of all, we talked about the challenges of precarious funding. This can be in the third sector, but also very much in the local authority. So concern over leaving the EU and not having EU funding anymore, and how that impacts on workers' well-being, and then if services are effectively cut because of that reduced funding, how that impacts on young carers that rely on services. But again, this wasn't just an issue for young carer projects, it was also very much something that kind of came out in terms of local authority provision as well.